LaPorte County, Indiana is located in the Milky Way galaxy. On the third planet from a medium-sized star, Sun. The planet consists mostly of two compounds, oxygen and silicon, and a form of organic spiritual matter called life. LaPorte County is 607 square miles of land located near the fifth largest body of fresh water on the planet. This area is inhabited by about 40 species of fish, 230 species of birds, approximately 1,300 species of plants, perhaps 20,000 different kinds of insects, plus an uncountable number of microorganisms. There are currently 44 species of mammals, such as the possum, whose ancestor can be traced back in North America 80 million years. In fact, if the 4.5 billion year history of the Earth were represented by 12 hours, living organisms would not appear until 10 o'clock. The dinosaur would not show up until about 11, and prehistoric man would not show up on the face of the Earth until about 12 seconds before noon. Of the countless events that have occurred, human beings have chosen to remember some. These are called history. The Michigan City Public Library, in cooperation with the people of LaPorte County, have selected a few of these events to help us understand those forces which have shaped all of our lives. For much of geologic time, this area was not land, but water. 400 million years ago, this area was covered by a vast saltwater sea. Lake Michigan, as we know it today, is a geologic infant, a mere puddle left over from a gigantic ice mass called a glacier. 4 of these huge glaciers swept over the land and then retreated. The last, called the Wisconsin, covered this area and began its gradual retreat about 16,000 years ago. The glacier formed the high ground, or the moraine, on which the spruce fir forests grew, and where lived the species wolf. These forests gave way to the vast, dense hardwood forests of maple and oak. Other species lived in the tall grass prairies, which covered large portions of the county, and with grasses so tall that they sometimes waved above the shoulders of the buffalo and elk which roamed over it. The prairie abounded with creatures and wildflowers, as many as 20 wildflower species in a single square meter of land. The southern portion of our county was covered by the extensive marshlands of the Kankakee Valley, which teemed with wildlife of all sorts. Shortly after the retreat of the glaciers, there is evidence that man came here to stalk the mammoths that lived here. These were people who did not have permanent homes. They followed the wandering animals. However, about 1000 BC, permanent towns and villages were developed by a people later called the Mound Builders, who built their cities and villages throughout the Midwest. These people had an elaborate civilization with agriculture, art, and a caste system which allowed a city of 20,000 to be maintained, as well as smaller settlements like those near Union Mills. They were a sophisticated people who shaped and formed copper and silver into beautiful ornaments and tools. They developed a trading network which extended to the Rocky Mountains, to the eastern seaboard, and to Florida. But their civilization underwent change, and we only have their artifacts to remember them by. For these mound-building people and their technology were unknown to the Miami and Potawatomi Indian who moved here in the 1600s. These were a people who depended on game and agriculture. They were semi-nomadic, and and built wigwams and raised maize and squash and cucumbers and tomatoes and many of the other staples of our diet today. They, too, established trade routes throughout the North American continent. They were a people who believed in a world in which day-to-day life was permeated by spiritual forces. The Indians' way of life was gradually but almost totally disrupted by the advent of visitors from the East. Men who spoke the French language explored this area, attempting to find a route to China. They explored and mapped this area using the Indians' birch bark canoes. Later, they discovered the value of furs and began using their huge canoes to transport furs which would eventually reach Europe. And they sang songs to lighten their burdensome task. It wasn't 100 years later that America's settlers from the East began to arrive by horseback, often following the Great Salt Trail of the Indian, portions of which later became Highways 2 and 20 in LaPorte County. Sometimes during the winters, settlers travel along the beach in their covered wagons. They quickly began making homes for themselves and clearing the lands for farmsteads. The Potawatomi Indian could not conceive of land ownership in the same way that the settler did, but he coveted the white man's goods so much that his own culture was almost totally lost. The Indian had little defense against the dreams and diseases of the white man. The settler wanted the land and feared the Indian, and the government wanted to please the settler, so after several treaties, those Potawatomis who refused to leave were removed at Bayonet Point to Kansas and later to Iowa. Their villages were burned, and many of the Indians died on this exile, an event to be remembered as the Trail of Death. At first, agriculture in LaPorte County was practiced as it had been in Europe, and the early farmers were also hunters and gatherers like the Indians. But soon, a steel plow was forged that could break through the tough prairie sod, and the settlers were able to emerge from subsistence living. Great trees abounded in this area. The pioneers cut the trees, which seemed unlimited, and they built sawmills to saw the lumber into beams and boards. And they also built grist mills to grind corn and wheat into flour. Barns were often raised by community effort. Prosperous farms were developed, and commerce soon flourished. Trail Creek was seen as the best site in Indiana for a shipping port. The harbor was dredged, and Michigan City became the largest grain shipping area in the Midwest in the 1840s. As many as 300 oxen carts a day would bring grain along the Stumpville-Michigan Road from southern Indiana and Illinois. Along these primitive roads, the horse and the oxen were man's companions and necessities. The horse on the farm pulled the plows and the cultivators and took surplus food to market. The horse took people to church on Sunday, took the kids for a ride, and got people around in the wintertime. In the country, it's been said that big horses were bred and big barns were built to haul and store the huge ears of corn that grew in the rich soil here. If that wasn't exactly true, it was quite true that between 1860 and 1870, a stagecoach line connected the small towns. The 4-hour ride between Valparaiso and LaPorte cost $1.25. People began building homes out of brick and wood, like those they remembered back east. Towns grew up with village squares and courthouses, and the pioneer days were just about over. In a few years, bands sprang up in every small town. They were mostly brass and mostly male. Well, mostly. And for safety and excitement, the cities organized volunteer fire departments. The men were paid 50 cents a month and were called to the fire by a bell or a shotgun blast, and they would race through the streets battling fires with great flourish. But unfortunately, often with little success. Later, horses replaced men as a source of pulling power, and the steam pumper replaced the hand pumper. But the towns were not unsophisticated. LaPorte had a medical college a decade after its founding, and shortly thereafter there were symphony orchestras and clubs and organizations in abundance. But change came faster now, this time on rails of steel. The railroads were enormously important, and people were terribly excited about them coming into the county in the 1850s. Every city fought to have a railroad, for the railroad could mean life or death to a town. The noisy wood burners were inefficient machines which hauled almost everything of value. And once in a while they ran on time to towns like Otis and Kingsbury and Wanata. Farmers and merchants on the rail lines enjoyed increased prosperity as their towns grew. The expansions of the railroads was encouraged by the Civil War. By rail, LaPorte County sent more men than any other Indiana county to the war, and by rail it brought back the body of Mr. Lincoln. The railroads needed boxcars. Workers in the Pullman plant in Michigan City made them. And LaPorte used boxcars to ship their crops and manufactured goods. When the prison was built in the 1860s, it was used as a source of cheap labor by local manufacturers until this practice was prohibited by law in 1904. Although there were many times of economic boom and bust, many towns survived and many businesses flourished. But still, some complained about the high cost of eggs at 14 cents a dozen and steak at 10 cents a pound. Hard physical work was an accepted way of life. Few people had servants, and almost everything was done by hand. The 11-hour day and the 6-day work week were not unusual for men, and for women at home, the hours were often longer. Everyone was expected to work hard on the job and to do their chores at home. The only ones not expected to work were the very young. But there were also times for celebration. One of the most eagerly awaited holidays of the year was the 4th of July. With parades and picnics, it was a day of relaxation for the entire family. For example, one might go to an afternoon band concert. Or a company picnic. Or one might go watch his favorite daredevil going up in the air, or in the water, like the lifesavers, the predecessors of the Coast Guard, men who rowed to the rescue to aid those imperiled by a temperamental Lake Michigan. On the 4th of July, they would perform some of their routine drills to the delight of the spectators. Or one might go to the beach and get dressed up and go swimming. Or one might decorate his house. Or one might just decorate himself. Youngsters would certainly wait impatiently for nightfall. The next day, everything would be still and quiet again in town, and people would be back to work. If you had been a young seaman, then you would have lots of things to think about. Lumber shipping had become a big industry to help rebuild cities like Chicago, or to help provide wood for the homes of the prairie farmers. Millions of board feet of lumber were being shipped out on the overburdened lumber vessels. Or you might have been the town's photographer, whose job it was to capture people's beauty on film. Or it might have been your job to sell people a new car. Or just a new wagon. But if things were going relatively well for people, all was not quite so good with man's fellow creatures. Millions of animals and birds had inhabited the valley of the Kankakee River for centuries. But this abundant game of one of the world's richest marshlands was being extensively hunted. Thousands of ducks, fish, and sandhill cranes were being shipped to restaurants and markets throughout the Midwest. Also, in the last quarter of the 19th century, good farmland was becoming scarce. The Grand Kankakee River was ditched and drained, its fertile soils transformed into corn and wheat fields. Huge tractors plowed the fields, making it possible for one farmer to feed many more people or livestock. The steam tractor not only plowed, it also threshed grain, and a local company, Rumley, became famous for building these high-quality machines. But if you were not working in the fields or factories, perhaps it could have been your job to be a teacher, to teach English and German and the principles embodied in the Guffey Reader, and then to supervise your charges at recess. But a child after school was on his own, free to play with his friends or his animals. Of course, only after his chores were done, like these boys at Interlaken School, who were harvesting ice for their school. Harvesting ice was an important industry in our county until 1930. They also helped build their own school buildings and helped prepare their own food. It was a minister's job to talk with his people on Sunday, which was still a day of rest and a time to get together with people of your own kind. The Polish, the blacks, the Germans, the Swedes, the Irish, the Syrians, they all had their own churches and their own customs. Marriage and family were valued. Divorce was almost unheard of. The minister was an important figure on days other than Sunday, however, because medical care was limited and lifespans were often too short. Perhaps it might have been your job to arrange for cultural events, like a ball or a pageant or the Chautauqua, which brought plays, music, and oratory from the big cities back east to the small towns of the Midwest. The county's largest towns boasted of opera houses and cultural events of all kinds. Plays and pageants and, well, when you got done cleaning your steam tractor, perhaps it might have been your job to play the violin at the opera. Perhaps you could have been the mayor supervising the replacing of wood streets with brick streets, or a policeman, or people who raised money for a new hospital, or people who printed newspapers in both English and German. Papers which told us of LaPorte County's problems like train derailments and houses that would sometimes tumble down the beach into the water, or that excursion boat that bumped into the Trail Creek Bridge in 1910. There are problem people, too, people who use hate and terror to enforce their values, and like the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, and people who made more mistakes than most of us. Fresh spirits continued to arrive in LaPorte County, however. People with different religious beliefs and cultures came in large numbers to make LaPorte County their home. Many people came from other regions of the country looking for greater social freedom and economic opportunities. Others came just to visit. Thousands came every weekend from Chicago on huge steamers to enjoy the sights like the huge sand dune called Hoosier Slide at the mouth of the harbor where the power plant now is. And while some people were climbing Hoosier Slide, other people found it profitable to haul it away, to be sold for glassmaking in foundries and filled. In the 1920s, it was gradually removed, boxcar by boxcar, often loaded by hand. The excursion business declined because people found a more independent and exciting way to travel. But while some found themselves stuck on the roads of LaPorte County, other LaPorte County men found themselves stuck in the trenches of the First World War. And people in LaPorte County plugged into the rest of the country to hear the news, and also to listen to their favorite entertainers.
Where's the money coming from with spending? Well, I don't know, but just offhand, I'd say it's coming from those that got it.
Dancing in the new Oasis Ballroom became popular, and so did the music of the big bands in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. When the Depression arrived unexpectedly in 1929, it hit everyone, some much harder than others. And Americans remembered how to live with less by gardening and saving and bartering. The economic realities of the day meant at least belt-tightening for most people. But most people did not turn to crime, except for entertainment. And the movies provided escape and laughter in hard times. The new art form also taught new values and changed a lot of our ideas about men and women and love. In the 1930s, the federal government stepped in with public work programs to help provide jobs. Parks were developed and improvements made in the zoo. But the federal government was not alone in looking for solutions. The local towns were inspired by local businessmen who formed chambers of commerce in 1918, and they got together to attract 24 new industries to the county. They were the first great carpoolers, too. They encouraged new industry to come in, and they also promoted the area as a great convention center. The 30s were not a time for expensive recreation. Simple ones sufficed admirably. Concerts in our musical cities were popular, and so were fun events like this hog calling contest. And this husband calling contest. The beach still attracted thousands. Many of them came by the South Shore Railroad, which began operation in 1908. The very last of the electric interurban trains, which had a dining car, a lounge car, and a schedule you could really believe in. And then basketball became the state's most popular derangement. Then all hell broke loose in September 1939. And this young woman began making bombs, and many kindly people helped make instruments of war at the Kingsbury Ordnance Plant in the 1940s. Some women got jobs in factories, and others did their part by painting their legs, thus saving nylons for parachutes. Factories worked around the clock, and the farmer produced more than ever before. And companies like Alice Chalmers, which had produced farm implements, now proudly produced anti-aircraft guns. And tanks now took part in parades. The war ended abruptly in September 1945. And people went back to doing what they had done before, only more of it. The farmer grew more and more crops, and people were delighted to find they could buy those things which had been rationed for years. Consumerism increased, and a new type of person was created, the teenager, whose life revolved around the automobile and whose idols were the entertainers of the day. The children of the community were taught new values in many ways. Not the least of which was the drive-in movie, which soon competed with the church for weekend attendance. In the 1950s, the TV set attracted the family as much as the warmth of the pot-bellied stove had attracted the pioneer family. And children spent hour after hour after hour watching. And some people began to wonder whether Matt Dillon was going to have more influence than Dad. Small town streets were empty of children playing, at least for a little while. Smaller towns, once busy farm marketing centers, wound down into nice places to live and to raise children. People drove into the bigger cities to work, and many students were bused to consolidated county schools. Only the churches and a few small businesses remained to service the area's farmers. Farms grew increasingly large, but fewer in number. To produce more food, the farmer depended more and more on massive machinery, bank money, and chemical aids. Superhighways crisscrossed Midwest, and patterns of life changed again. Cities tried to adapt by renewing what had deteriorated and by building new structures which would suit the community's changing desires. The 60s were a blur of change and confusing events. Minorities and youth questioned many of the traditional values and beliefs. Even the ideal American family with its 2.3 children came under question. Change was coming now at a rate much more rapid than ever had been experienced before by mankind. And people became aware that they were tied together in a world community. Perhaps to understand this land and these times, it would be good to ask those people who have lived through some of these changes.
Things sure have changed a lot since I was a kid. And I don't think it's too much to say that the automobile changed just about everything. People used to walk to where they worked. They stayed home more. They didn't spend a quarter of their income on just getting around in automobiles. I don't know. Even when we traveled someplace, we traveled together. The people on the streetcars seemed a lot friendlier than everybody driving around in their own car. I could walk down the street and I knew everybody in town. And I would tip my hat to the ladies. The peddlers would come down the street to sell fish and vegetables, and the women would come out to squeeze and buy and to gossip. It seemed much friendlier then. People didn't seem to rush about so much. They knew each other and they took time to talk. And the family seemed to keep together so much more then.
Well, to be honest, I think you'd have to say we've been a pretty narrow-minded community from way back. We've had our share of prejudices against just about everybody. The Polish, the Syrians, the blacks. We're people, I guess. And I guess nobody likes a stranger or somebody they can't understand. I don't think we've learned to really get along well yet. It's a shame, too.
Well, yes, I think you'd have to say we've lost something here. We used to have great forests, prairies, marshes. Now what have we got? We got corn, wheat, soybeans. I don't know. I think we lost something, but I guess people are eating better.
Eat better? Heck, back on the farm we worked a lot harder, but we sure did eat better. I bet you most folks today don't know what fresh milk straight from a cow tastes like, or hot cornbread. Holidays were mostly eating time. I bet you people today think that supermarket stuff is the real thing. Probably don't know what a real chicken tastes like, one that scratches for a living. I suppose cooking's easier today, but it sure ain't no better.
Well, speaking of scratching for a living, I'd take the chicken today any day than those scrawny ones we had on the farm. The Depression wasn't much fun for me. No food stamps then. At least today I'm eating regular.
Work? Well, hell, everybody worked in those days. Everybody put in long hours. Nobody complained. It was just what everybody did. man's job was a bigger part of his life. I don't know what it's coming to today. Oh, we had fun, but work was the main thing. It was a lot harder work, too. Mostly back work and not like this country club stuff they have today. It was a lot dirtier and poorer pay, but I don't know. I enjoyed it. You had a boss, but no fool computer. I felt like I was part of something.
You can't tell me it was so great. Seems like all we had time to do was work.
Just about everything's changed on the lake several times since I started fishing. Well, we used to get big catches of lake trout and whitefish. Used to start out sometimes at sunup, run out for 4 hours, pull net for 4 hours, then 4 hours home, and then we'd have to clean all them fish. Then the lamprey came up to St. Lawrence, and that changed everything. People still used to catch big strings of perch on the pier, but that's changed now too. Everybody's out fishing after them coho they planted. I guess we got some of the best salmon fish in the world right here, but people sure got a lot more time to do it. Yeah, it seems like people got a lot more money too. Oh, I don't know. I wouldn't trade my life for anybody's. Most everybody's got it easier today, except maybe the fish.
I don't know if anybody can say what television's going to do to us. Probably won't be any more important than fire or the wheel.
People learn a lot from TV.
No doubt it's educational. I just wonder what people are learning. I suppose kids would rather watch somebody doing something on television than to do it themselves.
We even have television in school.
Sure, there were a lot of nice houses in those days, but I guess it wasn't more than 10% of the people who lived in them. We're a lot better off today, most folks are. Inside plumbing has some real advantages, and so does central heat. I'm not so sure about wanting to go back to outhouses and open sewers. We're better off today. For all the hubbub about pollution and nutrition, the fact remains that we've just about doubled life expectancy in the last 80 years. Most folks have a better chance of living longer these days. Years ago, often a doctor couldn't do much to save his own family, and many kids and mothers died young. Diseases riddled families. In matters of health, we're much better off. The good old days were terrible when you were sick.
What'd you say, old-timer?
It's a lot quieter back then.
When?
Back then.